good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to today's webinar conference, New Frontiers of Shareholder Engagement. NYU is thrilled to be part of this discussion on this quickly evolving research area, and I want to thank the ECGI for sponsoring this event. As you can see, we have speakers from around the globe, which speaks loudly to the importance of this topic. Speakers also are from business and law school faculties, which I think underscores the wide net of interest in this area of research. Since I'm the new person, I'm not going to speak too much, so let me turn this over to my colleague, Giovanni.
Thanks, April. I would also like to give my warm welcome to all the participants, also on behalf of Bocconi, in particular of the Department of Legal Studies, who is one of the co-hosting institutions of these events. And I would also like to thank all the friends and colleagues who join us as speakers and chairs. And I have to say that some of them are joining despite of a quite challenging time difference, so we are especially grateful to them for being here. And of course, I will also thank the ECGI who provided an invaluable support to this event, and also the ECGI team who took care of every single detail to organize this event the best. As April already said, today we are going to have an interesting discussion that will touch upon some topical aspects of shareholder stewardship, so commitment to ESG objectives, collaborative or collective engagements, and the role of retail investors. And having the opportunity to have with us speakers from 3 different continents, presentation will also provide insight into some national industry practices and some national regulatory framework that can help in considering the stewardship effectiveness and also how to make stewardship more effective. But as we have a quite packed schedule, I stop here and leave the floor to Marco Becht.
Well, welcome on behalf of ECGI. It's my job to thank Sergio, April, and Giovanni for putting this together. ECGI is, as was said, it's a global event, and ECGI is really a platform to allow people, scholars, to collaborate globally. And I think this is a great example of what we can now achieve, one of the positive sides of COVID. I'd also like to thank Bocconi and NYU, both are institutional members of ECGI, and having members like them makes it actually possible that we can do these things. So I'm looking forward to the program, and thank you again. And Jeff Gordon always likes to emphasize that scholars and scholarship and knowledge knows no bounds, and we are collaborative by nature. And I think today's a great example. So thank you again to the 3 of you for having put it all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. And as you said, it's a very dense program, so I will not waste any time other than to introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Gordon, Columbia Law School and ECGI, who will present for 15 minutes his paper on systematic stewardship, and we'll have then 10 minutes for Q&A, and then move on. Jeff, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be presenting here, and as Marco says, the ECGI has really played a critical role in helping us all have a global discussion about these critical governance issues. If we can't govern the world, at least we can govern the firm, or think about how to govern the firm better. So the piece I'm presenting is called Systematic Stewardship, which is a particular view that I have about the kind of role that a steward in the large asset manager model can play, consistent with its low-cost, diversified portfolio product that it offers to the shareholders. And part of the goal of what I'm saying today is to provide a framework to understand what is surely a quite remarkable recent event in history here, which is to say the election of 3 new directors to the ExxonMobil board on the basis of a campaign run by Engine One, a proxy contestant that owned barely anything in ExxonMobil stock, 0.02%. Nevertheless, it was able to somehow to engineer the election of 3 directors, which of course requires a majority vote. And the reason that they were successful is because they were able to get support from the asset managers that I referred to, in particular BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, which together held 31% of the vote. And then you put together some others and you're at sufficient to elect directors. This is really a remarkable event that has sent shockwaves, I think, through the universe. Let's understand that Engine One it's not Elliott management. That is to say, it's not an activist in the style of trying to maximize every last dollar out of its investment. Rather, it specifically campaigned on the idea that the shareholders and the stakeholders' goals converge over the long run. And in particular, of course, it had a climate change focus. The point that I want to make, however, is that doesn't mean the fact that the proxy battle was successful doesn't mean that the asset managers who had supported it all of a sudden became in favor of the stakeholders. That's not their approach. The argument that I make is that the best way to understand what they've done is they've applied what I'm calling a systematic stewardship approach to the interests of their investors who hold, as I say, maximally diversified portfolios. And the core idea of systematic stewardship looks at modern portfolio theory and says that investors want to maximize risk-adjusted returns, not expected returns only, and that portfolio diversification by design results in the near elimination of idiosyncratic risk, but not systematic risk. It's very difficult to enhance expected returns for the portfolio, on a firm-by-firm engagement basis, because most of those interventions are going to be idiosyncratic, but a plausible goal for a widely diversified investor like an index fund is to reduce systematic risk. And indeed, if we can identify what the systematic risks are, and we'll figure out what they are, then by lowering those risks, you can improve the portfolio results, risk-adjusted returns. The critical move, and I want to emphasize this is not a trade-off model. This is not socially responsible investing in which you're prepared to accept lower returns in exchange for some desirable goal like preserving the climate. Rather, it's to suggest that climate change risk is systematic risk, and that mitigating that risk will improve risk-adjusted returns. So again, it's a finance theory defense of the behavior of these funds in voting for the new directors at ExxonMobil. Now, there are limits to systematic stewardship. Some argue on behalf of universal owners, claiming that universal owners will internalize all of the externalities. I think that that's factually wrong, given the distribution of share ownership. Basically, shares are owned by the top 10, 20% at most. So one could imagine that the interests of the top fraction are not necessarily the same as society as a whole. But nevertheless, there is a set of issues as to which the interests of the diversified shareholders, conditional on the distribution, nevertheless overlap for the interests of the broader society. So in thinking that this is a finance theory-based conception of welfare, it's not a general theory. Nevertheless, there are some wickedly hard dilemmas for which I think this approach is valuable. So, as I say, the goal of systematic stewardship is to provide a basis for engagement for these large investors that fits both a theory of investing and a low-cost business model. So the full account has a bunch of different parts, but because of the limits of time, I think I'm going to focus on specific pieces of the overall story. And there's a paper on SSRN for those who want to read the full version, and it's coming out in a law review soon. Okay, so let me just focus on the nature of stewardship. The current model, again, in the United States, is asset managers have guidelines that guide their voting across the portfolio. That's an easy way to engage. The performance-focused stewardship on a firm-by-firm basis, which some claim would be desirable, that's the Becht and Hurst approach, is relatively rare. And Gilson and I have an account of how the asset managers do engage, which is in effect rational reticence, in which the activists tee up proposals and the asset managers decide how to intervene. So how does this pivot to ESG stewardship? From our perspective, really ENS stewardship, and perhaps most importantly, climate change stewardship. It focuses on the nature of systematic risk that these ESG proposals engage with. And we identify first that there is reason to believe that there's a fair amount of systematic risk that still exists, and their finance accounts as to how that goes. Some would say that the market prices already reflect the risks of black swans and green swans, and that if we can reduce the systematic risk associated with those shocks, then we could in fact increase the portfolio returns on a risk-adjusted basis. Indeed, the whole idea, I mean, if you think about financial stability risk as a systematic risk, Basel is all about the idea of trying to reduce the systematic risk associated with that. Well, obviously, I don't think I have to tell this group that climate change risk is systematic, and there are many ways in which it could express itself. One obvious way, of course, is the transition costs, which have been focused on recently as, of course, costs across the portfolio as a whole. But the risk we all face is a nonlinearity event, right? In which an ice shelf slips into the Atlantic, raising the sea levels, or the Gulf Stream stops the normal flow. So those would cause enormous potential harm. There's also potentially social stability risk, and I'm not going to elaborate on that right now. I want to focus on the strategies that a systematic steward could play. one of which is essentially following the lead of the ESG proponents. Indeed, that's what happened in the Exxon Mobil case. And that's the classic way that these owners have responded to the activist interventions. If they are persuaded, they vote in favor of them. And they're exercising their rights as a shareholder in doing so. A second way that systematic steward could act is basically by protecting management that follows an ESG agenda, by voting in favor of the management team against an activist that thinks it's deviated too much from a shareholder model. The third is basically on its own initiative. Perhaps, and here is 3B, through firm-specific proposals, or indeed running a contest on its own. I basically think that prudentially, these large owners are better off essentially leading from behind, which is to say, counting on the energy of the activists to tee up their proposals. We've seen it work in the hedge fund space. It can work in the ESG space. We've seen it just work. So if the next version of Engine 1 has a proposal, then essentially a systematic steward could consider it and vote in favor. Again, exercising its rights as a shareholder, which I think would do less to excite negative energy in the political space. The concern about 3B, which is to say these funds acting on their own, is precisely the backlash concern. The final point I want to make, given the limits of time, is to rebut the common ownership critique, which is to say that implicitly in the actions I've endorsed, large funds could be acting in potentially a concerted way, not agreeing to act, but the parallel activity is obvious. And indeed, they may give rise to actions which cause what you might think of classic antitrust harm, which is to say prices might go up. But the critical difference, and the reason that I don't think we have an antitrust harm, is because of the impact on consumer welfare and social welfare. The important thing to focus on is that what the actions by the so-called common owners are designed to avert are an economy-wide negative event that will devastate consumer welfare across the board. That is to say, it might be the case that acting in this way to reduce systematic risk will achieve better risk-adjusted returns for the portfolio investors. And so the private benefits of their activity are indeed the point of my model. It's to say that that's what they're pursuing. But the beneficiaries of systematic risk reduction is everyone, because the damage associated with the realization of a catastrophic event, that's economy-wide. It's everyone would be worse off. And so therefore, avoidance of this welfare-reducing outcome ought not be a target of antitrust policy. So whatever the concerns you might have about common ownership in other areas, and I'm not necessarily one of those who thinks that the empirical evidence is very strong. Nevertheless, to the extent you have those concerns, owners acting out of the systematic stewardship concern to mitigate systematic risk are producing a benefit for society as a whole. And we ought not be concerned about that from an antitrust or a competition policy perspective. So I'm now at the end.
Thank you, Jeff. And we already have one question in the Q&A for you. I will read it, but you can also visualize it. If institutional investors have natural incentives to engage in systematic stewardship, is there, in your opinion, any need or room for regulatory activity, e.g. the newly reformed stewardship codes focusing on ESG, or will these codes be subject to the same issues as their previous non-ESG versions? Asks Philip Hulse. Would like to respond to that. In the meantime, if anyone wants to raise their hands among the panelists, please do.
Yeah, there's some in the chat. I don't know if that's, well, this is really about the European Sustainability Directive. You know, I haven't studied the Sustainability Directive in detail. I need to do so for the next version of the article, but I guess I'm counting myself as a skeptic that top-down governance is the right way to get at climate change risk by governments. There's certainly a role for the shareholders to play. I think the government role ought to be different. And it should, I don't think it should work through the governance channel, but it should work through a more direct channel to try to control emissions and the behavior of firms directly rather than try to shape the objective function of firms. I think that's going to be difficult to administer.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Now I have Steen Thomsen from Copenhagen.
Yes, I'm just going to unmute. Thank you very much, Luca. Jeff, congratulations on this paper, which has certainly, you know, helped improve my knowledge or my understanding of why it is that institutional investors and asset managers who are kind of from a corporate governance viewpoint, because they hold these big diversified portfolios, they're the villains almost, you know, because they don't care too much what goes on in the individual firm. And yet we see them kind of stepping up to this climate challenge in a major way. So I think you've given the perfect explanation of that. The follow-up question would be, we also see them being active in sustainability more generally. So while there might be a big market failure in climate, do you really think there is, let's say, a market failure in health, for example, or, you know, or social issues? For example, let me mention that Carlsberg, the Danish brewery, was dropped from many indices recently because people had found out that there is alcohol in beer. And you know, is it really the case that we need institutional investors to kind of, you know, guide us, you know, on these moral choices or not? I see a strong bandwagon effect where climate, which is justified, I think, from the viewpoint of investor activism, is carrying all sorts of other issues with it. All the 17 UN sustainability goals. I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah. Broader discussion, obviously. I've been wary of ESG as a package, precisely because there's some elements of E which are extremely important to us all. Some elements of S which may be very important. How you collect them in an index and purport to weight them is beyond me. I'm certainly not the first to observe that ESG has become a way in which funds market themselves to millennials who want to have the idea that their investments are doing good in the world, but you know, are not thinking too hard about actually what's behind the claim of ESG. So it's a brand rather than giving investors truly a deeply thought through method of how they can try to invest in what they regard as a socially sensitive way or a way to reduce risk, however they want to think of it. I guess I'm thinking that if an asset manager wants to market a product that is screened in a way to eliminate certain firms which act in ways that some investors regard as morally offensive, again, they're tailoring a product to meet investor tastes. And, that's okay. I mean, it's not that they're actively promoting the cause. They're just sort of, it's a matter of style, and they're selling a product. And I think investors have the right to, pick products that appeal to their overall utility, right, functions. And they may be idiosyncratic in the sense that they're opposed to beer. You never know. But that's as I say, that's marketing. When we're thinking of serious engagement of the type that would lead to the ousting of 3 directors on a big global firm, I think that's different. And BlackRock, to do that, I think needs a deeper theory than a marketing theory. And so systematic stewardship is designed with that in mind, rather than rather than fashion.
Thank you, Jeff. There are 3 panelists who raised their hands, and I would ask them to ask a question or make their comments sequentially. Then you will have the final word, Jeff, because we have to move on. So Jill, then Edmund, then Jennifer.
So Jeff, just very quickly, I'm wondering how your paper fits into the broader debate about stakeholder governance, because I guess your paper kind of privileges the views of shareholders and the interests of shareholders with respect to these social issues. But many times running a company in a more sustainable or an environmental friendly way might actually help the community more than it helps shareholders, or it might hurt workers more than it affects shareholders. And so, why should we, in the current environment, privilege the interests of shareholders to the degree that your paper suggests?
Edmund?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I think I understand the paper, or I find it very convincing, as long as you kind of assume a fixed, unchanged allocation of assets across asset classes. But I'm wondering about kind of the private optimality of the strategy. It seems to me that this kind of systemic governance would actually increase the ability of non-ETFs, of active investors, to potentially earn abnormal returns, which in turn could lead to an allocation away from the kind of money makers for these big funds. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Jennifer, thank you, Edmund.
Yes, thanks, Luca, and thanks, Jeff, for a great paper. My question is just to what degree you think, Jeff, that the changes over the last decade in the US, or maybe more than a decade, where global institutional investors have pushed, for example, for majority voting for directors, for de-staggering of boards, to what extent have those changes really strengthened the hand of institutional investors in these Exxon type scenarios? Yeah,
let me respond to those, maybe in reverse order. So Jennifer, in a sense, the answer is inherent in what you've asked, which is, single class boards, majority voting, do in fact empower the shareholders, and so they strengthen the hands of global investors. I'm not sure that they had systematic stewardship in mind when they were doing it, but plainly, if ExxonMobil had a classified board, perhaps, or if voting were plurality, then the owner's hands would be less strong, although this is at the margin, right? Because if Exxon only had 6 directors or 5 directors running the symbolic effect of replacing two of them would have been important nevertheless. Edmund, the point, I mean, you seem to be suggesting a screening strategy or a divestment strategy, leaving the opportunities to others to invest in these firms and earn rents. I mean, I'm actually thinking of an engagement strategy. And so I think that, I mean, ironically, at the moment that divestment, say, of fossil fuels producers becomes more accepted across universities, the chances for engagement, the value of engagement becomes higher. And I do think that divestment as a strategy, I mean, there's an ethical reason for it, I suppose, but in fact, it undermines the effectiveness of owners to act as systematic stewards. And so I think it has to be rethought from that perspective. Jill, so the shareholders versus the stakeholders. This, of course, is hardly an issue that can be addressed, you know, in 45 seconds. And I've kind of written myself about it. My own view is that the risk shifting associated with the shareholder value model is best addressed through various forms of social insurance and general activity efforts to assure that careers endure over a lifetime, even though there will be changes in the economy. I think the pursuit of stakeholder value is a chimera because it's random whether any given firm is going to be able to protect its employees against the shock of a dynamic, competitive global economy. And so we need far more robust social protections because employee welfare should not depend upon not only whether a firm is willing to engage in that way, but whether it can engage in that way, given the competitive environment in which it finds itself in. But that's obviously, there's a significant debate about these issues, but that's the position from which I'm starting.
Thank you, Jeff.